David and Laura seemed like the perfect couple, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever appeared out of place. But when two builders, Mark and Jason, entered their lives for a simple home renovation, everything began to unravel. What started as routine construction work soon spiraled into a hidden affair that shattered trust, destroyed love, and led to a shocking crime no one in the community could have imagined. David and Laura had been married for nearly 10 years, and from the outside, their life looked calm, ordinary, and enviable. Their house stood in a quiet neighborhood lined with identical homes, trimmed lawns, and neighbors who waved politely but never asked too many questions. David was a corporate employee who spent most of his hours inside a gray office, surrounded by meetings and deadlines. Laura stayed at home, keeping the house organized and handling most of the domestic work. They had no children, and that sometimes created long stretches of silence in the house, especially in the evenings when David worked late or traveled for his job. Laura felt those silences more than he did, and in time they became heavier than she could admit to anyone. Their house, although well kept, had been in need of renovation for a while. Small cracks appeared in the walls, the kitchen tiles had begun to loosen, and the deck in the backyard sagged from years of weather. David agreed it was time to make changes, so he searched for reliable contractors. After a few calls and estimates, he finally hired two builders recommended by a colleague. Mark and Jason arrived one Monday morning in a dusty van, unloading their tools and walking into the quiet home that would soon become the center of a scandal. Mark was older, tall, with the rough hands of a man who had spent decades in construction. Jason was younger, more energetic, and had the kind of easy smile that could disarm anyone. Laura greeted them politely, offering water and walking them through the areas that needed work. At first, it was strictly professional. They asked questions, wrote down notes, and promised to stay on schedule. David met them briefly before leaving for the office, shaking hands quickly and reminding Laura that she didn't need to worry, everything was handled. What he didn't realize was that his decision to hire these men would open the door to a chain of events that would destroy everything he had built with his wife. Laura spent most of her mornings in the house while they worked. She lingered nearby with small excuses, checking on their progress, asking if they needed anything, or commenting on how the kitchen would finally feel alive again. The builders welcomed the attention at first, seeing her as just a friendly homeowner who appreciated their work. But soon Laura's visits became longer. She brought them cold drinks on hot afternoons, shared snacks in the living room, and sat outside with them during their breaks. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have seemed harmless, but beneath the surface, a dangerous line was beginning to blur. The attention she gave them was partly innocent and partly a reaction to the emptiness she felt when David was gone. She had grown tired of waiting for him every night, tired of eating alone, tired of being invisible in her own home. Mark and Jason, on the other hand, noticed her growing presence and didn't shy away from it. The easy conversations, the casual laughter, and the unspoken glances grew more frequent as the days went by. What began as a routine renovation turned into something far more intimate. By the end of the first week, Laura found herself waking up earlier, preparing coffee for the builders before they arrived, and waiting by the window to see their van pull into the driveway. David was completely unaware. He left before sunrise, focused on his deadlines, and returned after dark, exhausted and oblivious. He trusted Laura completely and assumed the builders were nothing more than workers fixing up his home. The thought of betrayal never crossed his mind. He was blind to the subtle changes happening right under his nose, the way Laura smiled more often during the day, the way she seemed distracted at night, and the fact that she was investing more energy into the builders' presence than into their marriage. The neighbors, however, were not as blind. A few of them noticed how often Laura stood outside with the men, leaning against the porch railing, laughing at their stories. It seemed unusual, especially for a woman who had once been private and distant. Whispers began to spread, though no one dared to approach David. To them, it was none of their business, yet gossip circulated quietly behind closed doors. Inside the house, the renovations progressed slower than planned, partly because Laura encouraged the delays. She asked for extra touches, new ideas, and unnecessary adjustments, all of which gave the builders more reasons to stick around. She stretched their project timeline, creating excuses to keep them in her orbit. Every day they were there, she felt a mixture of excitement and danger. It was a rush she had not felt in years, and it fed on her boredom and loneliness until it became stronger than her loyalty to David. The tension that developed in those early days was invisible to David but very real to everyone else involved. Mark and Jason both felt drawn to Laura, though they knew it was reckless. Still, the boundaries weakened more each day. The closeness became physical in small ways, a hand brushing against hers while passing tools, a look that lasted longer than necessary, a moment of silence that carried meaning unspoken but undeniable. Laura did not resist. She allowed herself to drift deeper into this dangerous game, convincing herself it was harmless, that David would never know, and that she deserved the attention after years of neglect. But with every secret moment, the risk grew heavier. She didn't realize that what started as an innocent friendliness was quietly transforming into a secret that could not be hidden forever. The builder's presence in her life no longer felt temporary. It felt like something she wanted to hold on to, something that filled a void she had long tried to ignore. David was losing his wife, and he didn't even know it yet. The first chapter of this story closed with a sense of unease lingering over the household. To the outside world, renovations were underway, nothing more. But inside, a secret had begun to take root. Laura's loyalty to her husband was slipping away day by day, replaced by the forbidden thrill of her connection with Mark and Jason. Neither she nor the builders realized how far it would go, or how devastating the consequences would become. The foundation of trust that held David and Laura's marriage together was already cracking. But unlike the walls of their home, this damage would not be repaired with tools and fresh paint. It was the beginning of a collapse that would leave behind nothing but ruin, betrayal, and tragedy. The days rolled into weeks, and the builders became a permanent fixture in Laura's daily routine. The sounds of hammers, drills, and scraping filled the house from morning until late afternoon. But alongside the work came something much more dangerous, an intimacy that had no place in her marriage. Laura had crossed an invisible line without fully realizing it. What began as simple conversation and hospitality shifted into something far more deliberate. She was no longer just offering them drinks or meals. She was seeking their company, enjoying the thrill of being noticed, and craving the attention that her husband had stopped giving long ago. Mark and Jason were different men, but together they offered Laura a kind of excitement she had been missing. Mark, with his rugged confidence and quiet authority, made her feel protected. Jason, younger and carefree, made her feel youthful again, as though time had rolled back and she was not just a wife waiting for her husband to return each night. She started looking forward to their breaks more than anything else, when laughter replaced the sound of tools and their eyes lingered on her with a boldness that she did not push away. David, meanwhile, had settled into a routine that left him blind to what was happening. He rose early, left for work, and came home late, drained from the weight of his responsibilities. He noticed the house gradually changing with new walls, fresh paint, and polished wood, but he did not notice the far greater change taking place in his wife. She was no longer lonely. She was no longer waiting for him with empty eyes. Instead, she seemed distant, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. But David brushed it aside, telling himself that renovations were stressful and that everything would return to normal once the house was finished. The builders worked with skill, but they worked slowly. Laura encouraged this without hesitation. She added new requests, suggested changes, and insisted on extra details that prolonged the project. What should have been a 6-week job stretched further, giving her more time with them, more excuses to keep them near. Each day became a stage for secrecy, as Laura balanced her role as wife with her growing attachment to Mark and Jason. By now, the bond was no longer innocent. She had chosen to betray her vows, and the builders, despite knowing the risk, gave in to her. The house had become more than a construction site. It had become the setting of a hidden affair that grew bolder with each passing day. The secrecy, however, was fragile. Neighbors who walked past noticed how often Laura stood outside with the men, leaning too close, laughing too freely. Some whispered about her in hushed tones, noting that David was never around to see what everyone else could plainly observe. The gossip thickened, but no one had the courage to confront him directly. To them, it was entertainment, a scandal that unfolded in plain view yet remained hidden from the man at the center of it. Inside the house, Laura carefully managed appearances. She erased evidence before David came home, tidied up, and made sure nothing looked unusual. She told him the builders were making slow progress because of structural problems, and David believed her without question. The truth was far darker than slow work. It was betrayal etched into every corner of the house, betrayal that deepened as Laura allowed herself to become entangled in a secret life. Her relationship with the builders became reckless. She no longer feared being caught during the day, convinced that David's schedule left her safe. The men, too, grew more confident, no longer seeing themselves as employees but as participants in something forbidden. Their van parked outside became a symbol of temptation, and their tools scattered across the house became props in a story that had nothing to do with renovations. But secrets have a way of making themselves known, even without words. David began to sense subtle shifts. Laura's eyes no longer lit up when he walked through the door. She avoided conversations, distracted by her phone, and seemed eager for him to leave each morning. At first, he thought she was tired or perhaps frustrated by the drawn-out renovations. Yet a seed of doubt lodged itself in his mind, though he had no proof, only instincts. He tried to silence those instincts, convincing himself that his wife was loyal and that neighbors' stares meant nothing. Laura, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew what she was doing was dangerous, that if David discovered the truth, the fallout would be devastating. But the thrill of the risk kept her moving forward. Every time she heard David's car pull into the driveway, she rushed to erase signs of what had taken place earlier. The scent of betrayal lingered in the air even after everything had been cleaned, but David remained unaware. Mark and Jason, though different in personality, shared the same weakness, the thrill of being desired by a married woman. They knew the danger, but they didn't resist. The secrecy fed their egos, and the situation spiraled further. They no longer thought of themselves as temporary workers. They thought of themselves as part of Laura's world, a world built on lies. The longer the project continued, the deeper Laura fell into her double life. By day, she was reckless and daring, giving herself over to temptation without thought of consequences. By night, she played the role of dutiful wife, cooking meals and pretending everything was normal. It was a dangerous balancing act, one that could not last forever. But in those weeks, she convinced herself she could maintain both lives, that she could keep her husband and her secrets at the same time. The neighborhood, however, saw things differently. Behind curtains and across fences, people whispered, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They knew that secrets this bold never stayed hidden forever. They knew it was only a matter of time before David discovered what was happening in his own home. And when he did, the fallout would be far greater than anyone could predict. By the close of those early weeks, the house stood half renovated, a mixture of progress and delay. The walls were new, but the foundation of the marriage was crumbling unseen. David still believed he had hired two men to fix his home. In reality, he had unknowingly welcomed them into his marriage, and the cracks they left behind would not be patched with paint or plaster. The second chapter of their story was already written in betrayal, and the truth, though hidden, was creeping closer with every passing day. The first sign that David could not ignore came in the form of a whisper from his neighbor across the street. It was casual, almost careless, but it struck him harder than he expected. The neighbor mentioned seeing Laura spending far too much time outside with the builders, laughing with them in ways that seemed inappropriate. At first, David brushed it off. He told himself that people loved gossip, that neighbors always found something to say, and that Laura was far too loyal to do anything of the sort. Still, the words clung to him, gnawing at his mind when he tried to sleep. Once planted, suspicion grew like a weed. In the days that followed, David began to notice things he had previously ignored. Laura seemed distant, distracted. She no longer asked him about his day with the same warmth, and when he spoke, she often stared past him as though lost in thought. She was glued to her phone at night, scrolling through messages, quickly setting it aside whenever he approached. He noticed that she smiled more during the day, but never when he was home. At first, he convinced himself it was stress from the renovations. Yet small details refused to align: the muddy boots by the door even when it hadn't rained, the faint smell of sweat and sawdust lingering upstairs long after the men had supposedly left, the muffled noises from behind closed doors when he returned home unexpectedly early. One particular evening left him unsettled. He had finished work earlier than expected and decided not to call Laura, hoping to surprise her with dinner. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the builder's van still parked outside long past the usual hours. Inside, The house was eerily quiet. He walked into the hallway and saw two pairs of work boots placed carelessly near the stairs. His pulse quickened. He heard faint shuffling noises upstairs but froze, unable to move forward, his mind racing with possibilities. By the time he climbed the steps, the noises had stopped. Laura appeared moments later, composed, claiming the men had just left. David wanted to believe her, but doubt wrapped around him like a vice. He felt like a stranger in his own home. That night, sleep eluded him. He replayed the scene in his mind again and again, the boots, the noises, the nervous look in Laura's eyes when she saw him standing in the hallway. He told himself it might be nothing, but the unease refused to fade. For the first time in his marriage, he began to question Laura's loyalty. The trust that once seemed unshakable now cracked beneath the weight of suspicion. The following week, David tried to push the thoughts away. He buried himself in work, arriving home later than usual, but each time he entered the house he looked for signs, scrutinized Laura's behavior, and searched for something out of place. The distance between them grew wider, and Laura seemed almost relieved when he left each morning, as if his absence brought her peace. That subtle relief cut him deeply, though he said nothing. One afternoon, unable to shake the gnawing doubts, David came home earlier again. He parked his car a few houses away and walked quietly toward his home, determined to see what was happening when he wasn't supposed to be there. From the corner of the street, he spotted the builder's van parked outside. His stomach churned. As he approached, he heard faint laughter drifting through the open windows. It was Laura's voice mixed with the deeper tones of the builders. He stood there for several minutes, torn between storming inside and pretending nothing was wrong. In the end, fear of what he might discover kept him outside until the laughter stopped and the men left. Only then did he walk through the door, finding Laura composed but slightly flushed, claiming she had spent the afternoon cleaning. The lie was transparent, but he lacked proof. His mind began to spiral. He could no longer focus at work, replaying every detail he had observed, every suspicious sign, every careless remark from the neighbors. The foundation of his marriage, once solid, now seemed built on sand. He began to wonder how long this had been going on, whether Laura had chosen the builders before or after they started working in the house, whether he had been living with betrayal for weeks without realizing it. His suspicions drove him into obsession. He began leaving small tests around the house, things only he would notice: an item move slightly, a drawer left half open, a towel positioned a certain way. Each evening, he checked them meticulously. Time and again, he found signs that something had been disturbed, though he could never prove it with certainty. His paranoia grew sharper, feeding on itself. He felt like a detective in his own home, watching his wife closely, searching her face for any flicker of guilt. But the more he searched, the more distant Laura became. She avoided his eyes, spoke less, and retreated into her phone whenever silence filled the room. David's once stable world had transformed into a web of shadows and unanswered questions. He was living with a woman he no longer recognized, and two strangers who seemed to have taken control of his life. The weight of suspicion became unbearable. David knew he could not continue living like this, doubting every step, every glance, every sound. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. But instead of confronting Laura directly, he decided to gather proof. His mind, once logical and disciplined from years of corporate work, shifted into something darker. He began researching hidden cameras late at night, convincing himself it was the only way to uncover the truth. The decision to spy on his wife marked the beginning of a dangerous path. His suspicion had transformed into obsession, and his obsession was turning into something far more destructive. The truth was closing in on him, waiting just beyond the veil of secrecy. But he was not ready for how devastating it would be once revealed. The third chapter of their story left David standing on the edge of discovery, teetering between denial and rage. He had not yet seen the full truth, but he could feel it pressing against him from every direction. The house he once thought of as safe now felt like a stage for betrayal, and he was no longer certain whether he could keep his anger contained once the curtain finally lifted. The cracks in his marriage were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the entire structure collapsed under the weight of deception. David's decision to install hidden cameras was not made in a moment of anger but in the heavy silence of countless sleepless nights. He could no longer bear living with suspicion, waking every day wondering if betrayal was unfolding behind his back. It ate at him constantly, in meetings at work, during his commute, and even in the quiet moments when he should have been resting. He convinced himself that he needed evidence, something undeniable that would silence the whispers in his head and expose the truth that Laura worked so hard to conceal. The cameras were small, discreet, and easy to hide. He placed them in corners of the living room, in the kitchen, and upstairs in the hallway. None of them were visible to the eye, and Laura never noticed the subtle changes. For the first few days, the recordings showed nothing but routine movements: Laura cooking, cleaning, and occasionally talking with the builders in a casual, almost innocent way. David felt a strange mix of relief and shame, wondering if perhaps he had been imagining everything. But as the days went on, the footage began to change. He started to notice the closeness between Laura and the builders, the way she lingered near them longer than necessary, the way they touched her shoulder or brushed past her with a familiarity that no worker should show. At first it was subtle, but soon it escalated. The night David watched the footage that confirmed everything remained seared into his mind. He sat alone in the dim glow of his laptop, his hands trembling as the images played before him. There was Laura, not only with one builder, but with both. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was a reality so vivid and undeniable that it shattered him. The woman he trusted, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, was living a secret life right in his own home while he was at work earning the money that paid for the very renovations used to conceal her infidelity. His chest tightened as anger surged through him, a raw heat that consumed every thought. But David didn't act immediately. The rage inside him was volcanic, yet he forced himself to stay silent. He watched the footage again and again, each viewing fueling his fury, but he told no one. He couldn't bring himself to confront Laura without a plan. Something inside him wanted her to feel the same helplessness he felt, to know the weight of fear and exposure. So he played a dangerous game of patience, pretending to be oblivious while every moment burned like acid inside him. The days that followed became unbearable. Every smile Laura gave him felt like a lie, every touch a mockery. When she cooked dinner, he remembered the images of her serving drinks to the builders, laughing in ways she never laughed with him anymore. When she told him she was tired, he thought of the stolen hours she spent with them while he was away. Every moment became poisoned by the knowledge of what she had done. David moved through his life like a man possessed, consumed by images only he had seen. Laura noticed a change in him but misread it. She thought his distance was simply the result of work stress, never realizing that he was already watching her from the shadows. She continued her affair carelessly, convinced that David was blind to it all. The builders, too, grew bolder. They carried themselves with arrogance, confident that the husband was too distracted to notice. What they didn't know was that every move was being recorded, every lie captured in pixels that David studied late into the night. The longer he kept his silence, the darker his thoughts became. He replayed different scenarios in his mind: confrontations, revelations, even violent fantasies of retribution. His anger had transformed from suspicion into obsession, and now it burned without restraint. He imagined standing in front of Laura and showing her the footage, forcing her to admit everything. He imagined confronting the builders, watching the arrogance drain from their faces. But most of all, he imagined the chaos that would erupt when the secret was finally dragged into the light. One evening, unable to contain himself, David returned home earlier than planned. He walked into the house quietly, his pulse racing, half hoping and half dreading what he might find. The builder's van was outside again, and the faint sound of movement came from upstairs. He climbed the stairs slowly, his fists clenched, every step heavy with fury. He pushed open the bedroom door, and what he saw left no room for denial. The betrayal was laid out in the most brutal clarity, destroying whatever pieces of trust had survived. The confrontation was explosive. Years of suppressed emotion, suspicion, and quiet suffering erupted all at once. The house filled with the sound of shouting, the crash of objects breaking, the chaos of a man pushed past the limits of endurance. Neighbors later reported hearing noise but could not make out the words, only the violence of it. For David, it was as though the world had collapsed, and all that remained was the raw wound of betrayal. By the time it was over, the quiet suburban home that once stood as a symbol of stability had turned into a crime scene. The builders were left shaken, Laura exposed, and David consumed by the consequences of his rage. Police lights later lit up the street, neighbors gathered in clusters, and the entire neighborhood's whispers were confirmed in the worst possible way. What had begun as a simple home renovation had escalated into a scandal of infidelity and destruction, with David at the center of it all. As he sat in the back of the police car, hands trembling and wrists bound, David stared blankly ahead. The life he had built was gone, torn apart, not by accident, but by the deliberate choices of the people he trusted least. Laura's betrayal, Mark and Jason's arrogance, and his own inability to contain his rage had collided in a single night of tragedy. What once seemed like harmless renovations had uncovered the rot beneath the surface, leaving behind nothing but ruin. For Laura, the double life she had cultivated so carefully ended in the harsh glare of exposure. The neighbors who had gossiped now knew the full truth, and the builders who had once felt invincible were dragged into the scandal with her. None of them could escape the consequences. What they had all underestimated was David's silence, his quiet patience that had been nothing more than the calm before a storm. And when that storm broke, it destroyed everything in its path. The fourth chapter of their story was not just about betrayal, but about the unraveling of a man who discovered too much and held it inside until he could no longer contain it. The house stood partially renovated, its walls painted fresh, its floors replaced, but beneath the surface it carried the memory of what had unfolded within. No amount of plaster or paint could cover the violence, the betrayal, or the collapse of a marriage that had once looked perfect from the outside. The truth had finally been revealed, and with it came a tragedy none of them could escape. The night of the confrontation became a dividing line in David's life, a moment after which nothing would ever be the same. The house that once symbolized comfort and stability was now marked by violence and betrayal. The police had come quickly, alerted by frantic neighbors who had heard the shouts and crashes echoing through the quiet street. Red and blue lights painted the walls as officers moved through the scene, separating David from Laura and the two builders. Everything that had been hidden in shadows for weeks was dragged into the harsh light of reality, and the collapse of their lives became a spectacle for the entire neighborhood. David was taken away in handcuffs, his face pale and expression blank. The rage that had burned inside him for weeks had finally erupted, leaving him drained, hollow, and broken. He barely spoke as the police asked their questions, and when they read him his rights, the words felt distant, muffled by the roar of betrayal still echoing in his head. In the back of the patrol car, he stared out the window at his house half renovated, half destroyed, a perfect reflection of his marriage. The neighbors stood on their lawns whispering to one another, their suspicions confirmed in the most brutal way possible. Laura remained inside, shaken but alive. Her face was pale, her body trembling from the chaos that had exploded around her. In the eyes of the police, she was a victim of domestic violence, but the truth was far more complicated. She had built the web of betrayal that had trapped them all, weaving lies and secrets until it strangled everything in its path. Mark and Jason sat outside on the curb, their arrogance gone, replaced by shock and fear. What had once been a reckless thrill now revealed itself for what it truly was: destructive, shameful, and dangerous. They had walked into another man's home, crossed boundaries without thought, and now found themselves in the center of a crime that would haunt them forever. The investigation was swift. Police gathered statements, collected footage from David's hidden cameras, and pieced together the story. The recordings left no doubt about Laura's infidelity, showing the extent of her betrayal with both men. But while the footage confirmed the affair, it also painted David as a man consumed by obsession, quietly watching his wife from the shadows, building up rage until it finally erupted. To outsiders, the story was one of a husband who snapped under the weight of betrayal, a wife who risked everything for fleeting passion, and two men whose recklessness dragged them into tragedy. David's arrest became the talk of the neighborhood, and soon after, it spread further. The story of a wife caught cheating with two builders and the violent fallout that followed reached local news. Headlines branded it a scandal, neighbors gave interviews filled with speculation, and the once private couple became the center of a very public storm. Every detail of their lives was picked apart by strangers who knew nothing about them but felt entitled to judge. Laura became the villain in the eyes of some, the victim in the eyes of others. David was painted as both a betrayed husband and a violent offender. Mark and Jason were described as reckless opportunists who had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. In the weeks that followed, David sat in a cold cell replaying the events over and over. He wondered if there had been a moment when he could have stopped himself, a point where he could have turned away before everything collapsed. He thought of the years he had given to Laura, the trust he had placed in her, the future they had once imagined together. All of it was gone now, replaced by images of betrayal and the sound of police sirens. He tried to convince himself that his actions had been justified, that no man could endure what he had endured without breaking. But deep down, he knew that his rage had destroyed any chance of salvaging his life. Laura, meanwhile, found herself ostracized. The neighbors who once smiled politely now turned away when they saw her. The whispers followed her everywhere, branding her as the woman who destroyed her marriage and dragged 3 men into ruin. She tried to defend herself, telling anyone who would listen that she had been unhappy for years, that David had been distant, that she had felt invisible. But no one wanted to hear excuses. They only saw the choices she had made, the risks she had taken, and the devastation left in their wake. Mark and Jason disappeared from the neighborhood as quickly as they had entered it. Their work left unfinished, their reputations destroyed. They moved on to other towns, other jobs, carrying with them the memory of what had happened in that house. What had once been a reckless thrill turned into a reminder of how easily temptation can spiral into disaster. For them, Laura was not a lover to be remembered fondly but a warning etched in shame. The house itself stood as a monument to everything that had gone wrong. Half-renovated walls, unfinished floors, and scattered tools became symbols of the life that had collapsed inside. No one wanted to finish the work, and for months it remained empty, its silence heavy with memory. Neighbors avoided looking at it, as if the walls themselves whispered the story of betrayal and rage. It became a cautionary landmark, a place where curiosity turned to tragedy. As David's trial approached, the story resurfaced in headlines. Prosecutors painted him as a man who could not control his anger, who allowed jealousy and suspicion to twist him into violence. His defense argued that he was a victim, pushed to the edge by betrayal that no one could endure. The hidden camera footage, the testimony of neighbors, and the presence of Laura and the builders all became pieces of evidence, each pointing to a different version of the truth. But no matter how the case was argued, one fact remained undeniable: 3 lives had been destroyed by choices made in secrecy, and nothing could restore what was lost. For David, the days blurred into one another as he awaited his fate. He no longer thought of freedom or forgiveness. He thought only of the moment when everything cracked, when suspicion became proof and proof became violence. He replayed it endlessly, searching for a way he could have stopped himself, but no answer came. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and now he would live with the consequences. The tragedy of their story lay not only in the violence of its ending but in the slow, quiet ways it had built up. It began with loneliness, with small cracks in a marriage, with the simple decision to hire 2 men to fix a house. Those cracks widened with secrecy, with temptation, with reckless choices that seemed harmless at first, but grew heavier with each passing day. And when the weight became too much, the collapse was inevitable. The story of David, Laura, Mark, and Jason became more than just neighborhood gossip. It became a warning about the dangers of secrecy, the fragility of trust, and the destructive power of betrayal. For everyone who watched from the outside, it was a reminder that even the most ordinary lives can hide the darkest secrets, and that once those secrets are exposed, they can leave behind nothing but ruin. In the end, the house remained silent, the marriage destroyed, the builders gone, and David locked away. What began as a simple home renovation had spiraled into one of the most devastating scandals the town had ever seen. The echoes of betrayal still lingered in the quiet suburban street, a story that would never be forgotten, a tragedy carved into the memories of all who witnessed it.